So the title of Zohra's presentation and talk today is Home Sweet Home, but not quite. But nostalgia, domestic memory, and its undoing in selected Victorian songs. So yeah, Zohra, you can start with your presentation now.
I hope my screen is
Yeah,
visible.
yeah, yeah, your skin is visible.
Alright, so again, the title of my presentation reads Home Sweet Home, but not quite. Nostalgia, domestic memory, and its undoing in select Victorian songs. So, first off, how did I come to get interested in music, like Victorian era music? Is because in our bachelor's, as every other bachelor's English honors course, we had tests in our syllabus, and I sort of became impressed and quite taken aback by the aesthetic that Hardy puts out there, right? So I was impressed to an extent where I went and even purchased clothes which actually had a very Victorian women coded aesthetic. And that is when I also actively started listening to a lot of Victorian music. And during that time is how I started realizing that there are certain problems in the sort of music and how the flow of the music temporally changes a lot of aspects about memory, nostalgia, and domesticity. And then when Victorian Van Gogh happened, I sort of got a chance to revisit the old fascination with music. As Shauliti already said, I do work with music more than other texts, so it was again very fascinating to start with. So like I put up a few texts here for you to see. This idea that I've taken up of domesticity, memory, and then the discontents that arise therein are pretty evident in other forms of literature. Let's just say the poetry. For instance, Coventry Patmore has this poem, a long epic poem called The Angel in the House, where she talks about the virtues and ideal Victorian women sought to have. And then you see discontents already arising in such a notion of memory, even affect that we attach to domesticity. For instance, the classic yellow wallpaper that came out. And Freden is not from this time period, but then her work also about the discomfort of domesticity and the affectivities concerning domesticity is pertinent, so I put it out there. So I'm interested in seeing that how, if at all we can, locate these tenets of domestic memory as have been established and then contested and even undone through the music of the Victorian era. So, beginning with a little overview about the Victorian musical scenario itself, uh, Victorian era saw the rise of this new musical genre, which is the Victorian parlor songs. I have put up an image of what the painting is trying to depict, how the Victorian parlor songs setting would look like. So, due to an increase in the urban population, and then there was a rise in bourgeois, and they insisted on this, demonstration of their social standing, and for which it was very important for them to make clear distinctions in the sort of taste, quote unquote, refined taste, as Baudio would put it, the notion of taste, and through which they tried to very decisively establish those hierarchies. Even Lawrence Levine talks in his book Hybro Lobro about the emergence of hierarchy in America. So this entire scenario of music and the rise of bourgeois, this happened on the either side of the Atlantic, be it the British or the American side. So he talks about this notion of untouchability. We have Arnold who's already talking about touchstones, but then through music and through other forms of classical art, they also try to establish this notion of untouchable, or this entire idea of sacralization, that culture per se is something sacred. So not only are these texts, say music and Shakespeare, for instance, touchstones, but they're also untouchable. And so to constantly, for the constant persistence of that untouchability, it was imperative for such a culture and the sort of notions associated with such a bourgeois culture to be performed, right? So that is how music became a marker of class and refinement, because the setting of the songs and the content of the songs and the singers of the songs per se all were overarchingly driven by this theme of domesticity. For instance, in the parlor songs, majority of the women singers were sought, even for and piano teachers were sought, because the reason for seeking piano teachers was that for upper middle class or an upper class woman to be considered a morally virtuous and accomplished woman, it was imperative for you to know how to play a musical instrument, preferably the piano. So that is how this entire scenario of parlor songs and drawing room ballads came into the view. So mostly sung and performed by women. A lot of the corpuses of whatever we see was by women, and the thematic concerns were also therefore about domesticity, because needless to say, Victorian ideals of domesticity were inevitably and inextricably linked to this position of women in the household, an ideal Victorian household, so to say. So, moving on, what were some of the very initial songs that came out in this musical scenario? So, morality, nostalgia, and the idea of sentimental songs. This very popular song that came out in 1923 called Home Sweet Home, where we see that the sweetness is not just in the title, sweetness in every sense of the word that it can connote could be reverberated through that song. And it was so popular in terms of the nostalgic impact it could convey that later, during the American Civil War, this song had to be banned during army unions. So, because there was a chance of desertion, because it idealized and had a nostalgic magnetic pull towards the realms of domesticity, so to say. So, again, singing about home became a way to perform this cultural continuity, especially when we saw constant flux and forces of change, so soldiers, immigrants, and the empire expanding. So I'll quickly take you through the song so that we understand the lyrics. I do not have the original version of the song, but then I do have the contemporary renditions which are closest to what might have been performed at that time. So this is the song according to the score sheet of 1823. 1 second. I hope this is audible. Are you able to hear this? I hope that was audible.
Yes, yes, it's audible.
All right. So in this song, we
Mid pleasures and palaces, though we may roam, be it ever so humble, there's no place like home. A charm from the skies seems to hallow us there, which seek through the world is ne'er met with elsewhere. Home, home, sweet, sweet home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
right. So this song is basically trying to underscore this idea of nostalgia that is associated with home, and so much so that, as I said, it became popular as an allusion itself in other popular ballad songs, I mean parlor songs, where in other ballads and other composers will use this song and the singing of this song itself as an allusion in their plots. For instance, this song, which was written by J. Jordan, and so there's an excerpt from this song. The song was titled "The Song That Reached My Heart." And the memories of that night of bliss will never from me part. She sang a song of home, sweet home, the song that reached my heart. So again, this idea of care, comfort was inherently gendered, right? When we try to see other songs. Now, when we look at Home Sweet Home, there is nothing per se that would indicate the gender of the singer, right? But then, as has been indicated, that the song was sung by a woman with a piano, so that this entire scenario of a woman singing about home and longing for home is portrayed. And I put up a book here. This book is titled The Singing Bourgeois, and it is by Derek B. Scott. A lot of songs he himself has revived and performed from the Victorian era. I might be referring to one of them later. So, his book, The Singing Bourgeois Songs and the Victorian Drawing Room Parlor. So, he talks about this idea of how women songwriters were constantly writing and singing as this role of mothers. So, the four categories that he charts out of the topics that the women composers would choose, one of them was majorly this idea of impersonating as a mother figure and talking about the idea of home, domesticity, constantly throughout their songs. For instance, we have this another song which is called An Old Armchair. Now, again, I will not go into the musical aspect of it, and this is the last stanza of the song, which is talking about how the narrator or the singer sees her mother in an armchair while she's growing up, and throughout the course of her childhood, she associates a very caring, calming, soothing sort of memory and sentimentality with her mother sitting, growing up and dying in the very same armchair. So I'll read this out. This past, but I gaze on it now with quaking breath and throbbing brow. 'Twas there she nursed me, 'twas there she died. And memory flows with a lava tide, said folly dimly weak. So again, the idea of memory flowing, and then the idea of going back to uh, a very idyllic past, which was sought in these kinds of songs, right? And what is very important to note, because these songs are inherently gendered, typically women were depicted as romantic objects and placed in a context of family, and this onus of maintaining the familial ties and therefore the entire idea of nurturing was on the women. So, what becomes very relevant in this context is this Sylvia Federici's work on patriarchy of the wage, where she talks about how women's labor, again drawing from Marxist idea of uh, unpaid labor of women. So that becomes very relevant here. Also, Victorian historians like Nancy Armstrong and Anne Douglas, they, while analyzing the fiction, but we can also see how it holds true about the music that was produced and heard and in demand. We see how women were essentially driven towards catering to the family, and the sentiment and the affect of care, nurturing, and morality was seamlessly embedded in their narratives, which talked about women and their characterization, right? And again, we have Gilman Brown, who talks about this on the other side of Atlantic, where she talks about domestic individualism and how domesticity and the ideas associated with domesticity shape both the selfhood of men and women, not to mention the queer bodies at that time, right? So, for instance, in America, where she says, and I quote, men were uh, asked to have these tenets of what she calls self assertiveness and self reliance, where again women, through their characterization in works and writings, were inextricably tied to this idea of domesticity, care, nurturing, and this idea of maintaining a home, right? So, what we see later, I took you through some songs. So, we had another very important song, and by the way, I have some graphics here which I might forget to elaborate on. So, this is a building in the west of Virginia where the musical notes of Home Sweet Home have been etched. And it sold round about 100,000 copies when it was first out. And a similar song which was played at that time is This Old House at Home, right? And there are at least 200 public homes right now in England which are named potentially on the basis of this song. So, with this name, The Old House at Home. Again, this is again a very sentimental song, and every time you search any of these songs, the description would say 19th century sentimental song or a Victorian sentimental song. So the sentimentality embedded in these songs and very feminine and gendered sentimentality is very purposeful. In that sense, we could very well say that these songs act as emotional technologies which were deployed to, sort of sediment the Victorian morality around household domesticity and to sort of affirm gender roles. This again, here's a very strong calling for memory and nostalgia, in the sense that wanting to go back to a lost time. For instance, again, you can see the reference to mother here, where a child at the feet of my mother I knelt, where she taught me to pray, where she read me the page. So again, mother being the guiding light and someone who drives the ideals of the domesticity. And then again, wanting to return back, but now the old house is no dwelling for me, the home for the stranger henceforth it shall be, and never will I view it nor row as a guest over the green fields with my father possessed, yet still in the slumbers sweet vision will come of the days that are past and the house at home and that old house at home. So again, this song itself was steeped in nostalgia and wanting to go back. But what is also important here is that these songs are sung in upper middle class and upper class households and by upper class women, and the themes are also mostly about the households and the matters of domesticity concerning the upper class. Why was that so? Now, that is also because it was less hypocritical and less visibly problematic to portray the lives of the upper middle class, because the discontents and the problems of portraying such domestic ideals with the lives of working class would be deemed problematic and easily, pointed out in that scenario. So that is why the values of a perfect and honest country maiden were associated and thematically concerned in these songs with the upper class women. So what happens a little later around, so this was in 1823, Home Sweet Home and other opera that was being performed with similar themes. And move a little ahead, this is around 1846. Now we are at the mid of the 1800s, and what we see, there is a shift, a sort of jilt from nostalgia to a sort of emotional disconnection. It is not entirely a sort of undoing, which I've written in my title, but a sort of dislocation from that magnetic pull towards this idea of nostalgia, domesticity, and the memories of home. What we now see in the songs that come up is disconnection, or what Norrin Burden, and I'll talk about it in a while again, calls flat effect, right? So it is not the absence of emotions, but not the emotional expression as would be expected by a social or cultural milieu of a certain time. So, for example, When I Am Dead, My Dearest, this is by Christina Rossetti, the Song of the Shirt by Thomas Hood. So, around this time, writers started composing according to the musical scenario in the Victorian age. Something that I talked in the very beginning, how literature and the themes portrayed was also in a dialogue with other art forms. This was very visibly predominant in the modern era, but you could also see slight beginnings of this interarts dialogue between, let's just say, literature and music, or theater and music in the Victorian era itself. For instance, Christina Rossetti, and before that, what happens is that the writer's works both informed and were being informed by the musical scenario. For instance, there was a revival of ballads, ancient ballads around this time, and then the writers also incorporated this metrical schema in their writing so as to approximate to the current musical scenario, and so that their songs are deemed more singable. That is how we see Christina Rossetti's poems A Birthday, and another poem which she titled Song, which was then performed as When I Am Dead, My Dearest. This was among the 22 most frequently said poems of the era, and it was set to music at least 40 times before 1900s, right? So the song became immensely popular, and Rossetti herself wanted that, and so did other poets like Tennyson, right? So Rossetti wrote to the publisher that more of my things are set to music, the more pleased I am. And post publication of Goblin Market and her other poems, composers already began requesting to set her poems to music, right? Which was after 1862. So again, what we see, as I talked about Lauren Berlin a minute before, we see this idea of flat effect. So again, the setting is a home for Thomas Hood's poem I Remember," and again a very familial uh, theme in When I Am Dead, My Dearest, where the lover is talking about uh, her death and how she should not be remembered. So the domestic ideals of a family are slightly jittered now when you see through this song, right? So she talks about how she would not be present anymore, and the force of the memory, which was almost magnetic, the current of that nostalgia has seemed to, be withdrawn, and the memory is not as potent as it were before. So the affect is very flat in that sense, as Berlin would put it, and this is very decisive on the part of Rossetti. And I will take you through this song very quickly. It is basically a lover addressing the beloved on how she might or might not be remembered after her death.
When I am dead, my dearest, sing no sad songs for me. Plant thou no roses at my head, nor shady cypress tree.
So again, in the very beginning of the song, the stone is said that when I am dead, do not remember me, and it is further amplified as we move ahead in the song. I'll skip.
Wilt forget. I shall not take a shadow
Right. So the stress on the word happily and the way Rossetti employs it dually. So whether she remembers or she forgets their time spent together, the memories, perhaps if we extrapolate a bit of their home, is would be, happenstance. So in that sense, how a memory which was so strong and magnetic before is now weakened, and the affect associated with domesticity therefore also, to an extent that where remembering is not as much a necessity. And again, this was in 1946. A little earlier in 1843, sorry. 1846 and 1843 are the dates, right? So 1846 is when Rossetti composed this. And a little ahead, 1843, we have Thomas Hood, who talks about the working class. As I said, the working class were not talked about in the first quarter of the 1800s. That was because the problems in portraying such a domesticity would be very evident in those themes when concerning with the working class. But then in the mid 1800s, writers took up the plight of the working class and put it to music. For instance, uh, the Song of the Shirt, which was based on a real life instance of this working lady, Miss Biddle, who would sew shirts and trousers in her like home, and she would be paid a very meager wage for that, and she was in debt. And Thomas Hood wrote about her plight, and it was set to music by this uh, very influential musical family called the Hutchinson family, who used to set to music any piece written on social reform, and therefore the plight of the working class became a very preferable subject. So the song basically talks about how the very ideal of a woman sitting on an armchair, where it is associated with care and comfort, we see how the affect is completely disoriented in this case. Now, this is a woman who is again in the same domestic setting, but this time the affective registers that you can attribute are not care, concern, and sweetness from that poem, song, if I were to borrow. So it's harsh, coarse, and very cute.
Fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red. A woman sat on lonely rag, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger, and dirt. And still with a voice of dolorous pitch, she sang the song of the shirt. Work, 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 while the cock is crowing aloof. Work, 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 till the stars shine through the roof. Oh, it's oh to be a slave, along with a barbarous Turk, where woman has never a soul to save, if this is Christian work. Work, 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 till the brains begin to swim. Work, 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 till my eyes are heavy and dim. Seam and gusset and band and gusset and seam, till over the buttons I fall asleep and sew them on in a dream. Oh, men with sisters dear, oh, men with mothers and wives. It is not linen you're wearing out, but human creatures' lives. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger, and dirt. Sewed at once with a double thread, a shroud as well as a shirt.
Right? So the keywords here are not memory and remembering or going back. It's poverty, hunger, dirt in the very same domestic setting. So we see a shift in the sort of affect that was attributed to the idea of domesticity when the working class also come into the picture. Again, Sarah Ahmed also, in line with what Lauren Berlin talks about flat effect, and which was very relevant with Rossetti, not expressing an emotion as expected or as much intensely in a certain code of culture. So, Ahmed also talks about the side of affective disorientation, which can sometimes be handy because it can help you queer spaces and bodies, right? So querying of domestic spaces like home, because orientation is associated with the sense of belonging and comfort, and when there is an affective disorientation, so the sort of affect that this song reverberates is of discomfort and disorientation with the idea of home. So it calls for a change and is a sort of ripple in the nostalgia that was hitherto sedimented in the Victorian moral and social milieu through music and other forms of literature, right? And towards the end of the 19th century, we see a rise and revival of old ballads, that is between 1889 to 1883 to 1891. um, I have the dates in the later slides. So that's like towards the end of the 19th century, we see this revival of ballads, right? Old ballads. Some of them are from 17th century, some of them are even older. And we see this rise of the very own Victorian trope of the Gothic and the uncanny. And this too enters, like any other form of literature or art, to the musical scenario of the Victorian age. Now we see Victorian songs as this affective cartographies, or if you have to map the emotions associated with Victorian household or the ideals of households, a family, love, nurture, if you want to map those through the kind of songs that were being uh, produced, what we can see is there is a movement from stability, which was in the early songs, and then a sort of ambivalence, which was there in Hood and Rosetti's performance, to this sort of rupture, which now enters the scene through the revival of ballads, like Francis Child started to revive quite old ballads, and a lot of them had this overarching theme of the Gothic and the uncanny. So memory was ideological first, and then we see an affective turn, a disorientation, and towards the end, we see how by this time these memories become spectral. Memory is no longer redemptive as it were before, nor is it just unsettling or ambiguous, but it becomes spectral. For instance, the songs like the Mistletoe Bow, Barbara Allen. Barbara Allen, I have a picture here, and then the Uniquid Grave. So these are songs which undo and unsettle this entire sweet, ideal, and comforting affectivities which were attributed to domestic life and to the gender roles in these domestic lives so far. So, for instance, the Mistletoe Bow, this was uh, set to music by Henry Rowley Bishop, and this was initially produced in 1830s, but then it came to be performed later in the last half of the 18th century again, sorry, 19th century again. So the plot centers around this myth of the mistletoe bow, which has various renditions, and the central point being this bride who, the very day of her marriage, is engaged in this play of hide and seek. Right, so I have a picture here as well, and she tries to hide and could not be found for years until the skeleton. And here's a picture from another rendition. So, a haunting figure of this bride comes to the lover or the husband years later. And again, this has been put to music very recently, and I'll play a few parts of the last song.
Lay withering there in a living tomb. Oh, the mistletoe bough. Oh, the mistletoe bough. Was told as a sorrowful tale long past, and when Lovell appeared, the children cried, see the old man weeps for his fairy bride. Oh, the mistletoe bough. Oh, the mistletoe bough.
On the last chapter of this point, we see how the haunting presence of the bride layers later. The intention of family is disrupted here, as the women should have been, like you saw in earlier songs, right? So finally,
At length an oak
Zora,
chest that had long laid hid was found in the castle. They raised the lid, and a skeleton form lay mouldering there in the bridal wreath of the lady fair. Oh, sad was her fate in sportive jest. She hid from her lord in the old oak chest. It closed with a spring and her bridal bloom.
right? So we see how this entire song is reverberating this sort of affect of the uncanny, haunting, and the gothic. Shauli, were you saying something?
no. I thought that you are, I thought because you were speaking while the music song was still playing, no? So it was not
Yeah,
audible.
I was waiting for it to play. The last stanza was what I was trying to
Oh,
highlight.
okay. No. You were audible properly. I thought like it was some technical issue, but now you
Got
go ahead.
it right. So this was one of the songs, and then there are other songs. For instance, Barbara Allen. It is a very popular song, and it has different names to it. For instance, the Barbarous Allen. So this is the figure of the femme fatale. So again, we see that how the figure of the woman from caregiver changes to this idea of a femme fatale now. So Barbara Allen uh, is again a very popular song. I'll just play a few lines from the song to give you an idea of how it sets a plot which entirely under the established notions of the Victorian domestic household and the women of that household or the lady of that household.
In Scarlet Town, where I was born, there lived a fair maid dwelling, made every youth cry well a day. Her name was Barbara Allen. In the springtime of the year, when all the flowers were blooming, sweet William on his deathbed lay, for love of Barbara Allen. He sent his servant to the town, the place where she did dwell in, saying, Master dear has sent me here, if your name be Barbara Allen. So slowly she got up, and slowly she drew nigh him, and all she said when there she came was, Young man, I think you're dying.
Right. So the plot and the entire idea of what is portrayed in this song is this femme fatale, and the setting of the home is not a very merry one this time. It's a deathbed, right? And a man pleading to his love on the deathbed, and she very coolly replies that, oh well, I think you're dying. So again, this is an undoing of all the virtues and all the sentiments that were associated with domesticity thus far, right? So we see this turn, and again, as we have another book that I put up here, every Gordon's ghostly matters, and very much coincides with Freud's idea of the unhomeless. She talks about Gordon talks about how this idea of ghostly matters or the ghosts and the haunting is not just psychological or literally spirits or literal. in the sense of a literary technique. More than that, it's also about the sociological, repressed, and oppressed sentiments which take the form of the gothic and the haunting, and which is very well corroborated by songs like Barbara Allen and another one which I would not play right now, the Uniquid Grave. So the song is about this man who weeps outside the garden of his graveyard, and he mourns for 12 months. I'm zooming in the picture, which is from a performance. He mourns for 12 months, and after that, we see the figure of the beloved coming from the grave and reprimanding him that why he would constantly be weeping, and the sound of the weeping does not let her sleep. So, oh, sorry, that's my cat. Well, so this entire weeping of the lover does not let the lady sleep. And so again, the idea of haunting, and as Gordon would have said, this haunting also represents a sort of repressed feminine and a sort of repressed sentiments and a sort of histories which were not given space so far in other forms of expression. So, Gothic in these songs can very well be read in lieu of the ghostly matters or this very idea of unhomely, something which was hitherto familiar in terms of the settings or in terms of the affect or the memories that these songs were associated with, and how this now suddenly turns unhomely or unhomelish and unfamiliar is what these songs try to portray. Now, towards the end, what is very interesting, and I came across this by chance while I was trying to look at the songs and read more about them, that the moment from domesticity is not just thematic in the sense that now the themes are set outside the home or not so much concerned about the home, but even women, the concern is not so much about the ideal woman but now a haunting woman or a working woman. This movement is not just textual or musical, the movement is physical as well. So for instance, uh, uh, by the end of the 19th century, we see rise in bicycles, right? The social technologies, and how women also took to this uh, leisure of bicycle riding, and therefore, uh, as I already established, a lot of singers and musical teachers were females, and this rise of bicycle and therefore engaging in this activity of bicycle riding saw a downfall in parlor songs and new forms of music started emerging. For example, the Tin Pan Alley, which you can read more on. It's a very interesting genre. So, parlor songs and physically women became displaced from this drawing room setting or the parlors where the songs would happen. So, musical magazines started creating this. A sort of propaganda where they came up with this sort of a malady, invented malady called the bicycle disease. So this is from the 1869 musical time, where they say that uh, uh, you know women riding on bicycles is a loss to the musical output, and they would also uh, talk about sort of uh, diseases or the sort of problems that women on a bicycle or riding a bicycle was caused to women. For instance, it says we may point out new and the most formidable enemy of the pianoforte has arisen of late is the bicycle. So thousands of young ladies whose leisure hours formerly passed in large part on music stool are now spent in saddle of the Iron Bird. Proof positive is all afforded by advertisements and announce the sale of pianofortes by individuals at great sacrifice. Right, so they started writing propagandist articles, a lot of musical magazines on this very idea of women going out of the homes. So it was very interesting to note how the movement, not thematically, musically, but was also physically from the parlors and the parlor songs. So to conclude, we see this timeline again. 1823, we have Home Sweet Home. Then we see a shift towards the idea of working class and the domestic scenario there, the Song of the Shirt. sort of flat effect and disorientation arisen when Rossetti wrote When I Am Dead, My Dearest. And from 1882 to 1898, this was the date I was referring to there, Francis Child began recovering balance, and the two most popular ones were Barbara Allen and the Unique Grave, right? So even modern contemporary renditions of Victorian music have this idea of haunting. For example, I put up a picture here. The songs are modern and by modern singers, but they would put up simulations like these, right? So we're able to see how as literature would corroborate to this, so does music, that how these inherent contradictions within the affectivities and the sort of construction of memory in a age leads to its lapse in new ages. For instance, in this case, the modernism, right, which was very much problematizing this entire Victorian prudence and the idea of domesticity or the feminine morality, which was being tried to be foregrounded throughout, right? So I hope we are able to make more such parallels. For instance, I did not elaborate on a lot of things which could be because of the paucity of time. I limited myself to the idea of domesticity, nostalgia, and the gender which was being involved here. There is a lot that could be explored. For instance, the entire trajectory of music in lieu of the working class per se, or how it was in sync with other forms, such as, I use literature here, but theater again, whatever little theater was being done, how the music corroborates to the movement of music corroborates to the sort of engagements happening in theater in that sense. And that said, thank you for being so patient.
Thank you so much, Zora. It was a very wonderful presentation, and I think everyone enjoyed it because we were all hooked. Yeah, some people are clapping for you as well, as you can see. So the entire presentation was very intriguing that we were hooked. And your song selection was so nice that we really loved. It felt like a musical journey. It felt like musically your entire presentation. So thank you so much. I think your cat also appreciated this presentation as well. So I loved your presentation, specifically how you brought in the theme of flat affective while talking about the domesticity, because we know how important of how important an aspect of um, Victorian age domesticity is. And you talked very well about the songs and how the songs have this gendered sense of mobility. At the same time, they are talking about so many aspects, be it femme fatale or be it the idea of the home. So, in all the ideas, the domestic remains the centrality, which reinstates the morality. So that was very interesting. So, I mean, the floor is up for the audience now so that they can ask you any questions
Or
regarding your presentation. So, Zoya is congratulating you.
thank you so much. Just a side note, just an aside. I mean, I as well. I think I mentioned it before. Also, this is just to get feedback that I keep working on music per se. Like my dissertation is focusing on South Asian songs, right, and the entire idea of memory and affect and how it plays out in songs. So, working with songs has always been a fascination because I feel like music very well can capture the pulse of an age. So the moment of an age can be very well traced by the kind of movement that the music takes in, and that is what interested me here as well.
Right. Inananda, do you have a question?
I do not have a question, but I was like hooked to the presentation as you rightly pointed out. It was like a wonderful presentation that I'm very glad that we could have you on Victorian Vanguard, Victorian Sundays. Thank you, Zora. Thank you very much. I'm sure the audience would like to ask a question or two.
Yeah, the audience, I think, because Zohra explained everything. I saw in one thing in her presentation that the questions that were being arised in my minds, the very next moment she would like mention the question and answer it herself. So that's why I think that is why all the questions are answered. And then she talked about the lim. That is a very brilliant thing that you did. That you talked about the limitations of the your presentation by yourself at the end. That similar works can be done in performance studies and stuff like that. So yeah, I think all the questions are answered. So I wanted to ask you something. I mean, that is that idea of the body, idea of the women's body. How do you think, by considering the idea of the flat effect, how do you think the idea of the women's body come in our, I mean, do you think the songs visualize the women's body with the passage of time, and how the transition has been there?
Right, I think thank you for that question. So, I think the idea of body, even if it is not very viscerally present in the songs, we
Hmm.
can also trace the movement. For instance, in the initial songs where all the women who have been talked about, for instance, picture a mother in the armchair. So the
Right,
idea of women and the bodies, therefore, is very much catered to the male gaze and the sort of
right.
bodies that would be desirable, right? And towards the end, when we look at haunting and the idea of gothic or the femme fatale, so we see how the bodies are now, for instance, the
Changed.
bride rising from the grave. So I did not mention the entire song, but the lyrics say that my breasts are cold as clay and my color is withered. So the shift is also in the bodies, in the sense from desirable bodies to withered and cold bodies. In that sense,
Hmm.
gothic presence and semblance to those bodies. It is also a defiance to sort of male gaze and the sort of desirability of the bodies that was demanded by the male or the patriarchal system of that time. So I think, yeah, that plays a role. Even Rossetti's poem and the idea of flat effect becomes relevant there, because she does not want to be remembered. It, in that sense, all
Hmm.
the aspects associated with her also do not want to bear the burden of memory, and therefore she disrupts this idea of idealizing and almost putting this woman's body as well as the women's ideals to a very high pedestal, or let's just say a very divine pedestal. So she disrupts all of that. So we see a flow, also with the idea of body in these songs.
Right, that is a very, very good answer, Zora. Though another thing that I noticed your presentation, which is just an insight, is that idea of the parlor. So I think this is a very interesting thing. If you see that the idea of the parlor has transitioned momentously throughout the passage of time. So we see
Right,
the parlor as a space of domesticity throughout the Victorian. Then before that, the parlors emerge as this idea of a place where just communication, mere communication is happening.
right,
Then parlor becomes this place where women come to talk, chat. So the
right,
parlor becomes this very locus of communication for women and women
right,
interaction. In
right,
specifically, if you look at Westland also, no, there is this entire chapter on parlor,
right,
this parlor
pardon,
chapter where
right,
women talk, coming from war and women talking about.
yeah,
So this becomes a very
yeah,
locus of women's
yeah,
communication where women didn't have other places for communication. At the same
right,
time, for like French Revolution and other revolutions, parlors also become a lacuna where the revolutionary ideas emerge through discussion. So that and parlors say similar like songs emerging from similar parlors become very fascinating.
right. Parlor is almost like this emotional marker, it helps you map, like I wrote in my
Exactly.
presentation. So, they act as these cartographic sort of markers where you can see what is the influx, and how does the emotionality associated with domesticity, women, everything
Mhm.
change. It sort of witnesses all of that, from women
Exactly.
sitting in there and performing on gender, domesticity, and the subjects, to women coming out of parlors and then again going for discussions, and the sort of emancipatory turn. So the parlor is sort of a marker through which all of this can be traced, and in that sense it becomes a very important spatial memory, if we talk in terms of memory.
Right. That is fascinating. So I think with that we will end. Oh, so Snigdha Jyoti has a question. So he is asking, how can the idea of mad women in the attic, uh, sorry, one second, mad women in the attic discovered in the songs?
Right. So, definitely there are modern renditions to Mad Women in the Attic, not there in the Victorian era. But then, if you talk about the sentimentality or the sort of idea that we attribute to this Mad Women in the Attic, I think one central point would be the feminine rage, right?
Mm, right.
And when the gothic turn in this music comes, you very well are able to see in a lot of songs, like I mentioned, even in Barbara Allen, the
Mm,
coldness and also the underlying, which is very latent in some songs and very outright in some songs, the idea of feminine rage in that sense is very much visible there in these songs. As for the attic, I think confinement is another aspect which I could not visibly see in the songs, which is again, if we trace it back, it is the politics of music making and the sort of
mm,
scrutiny that you could not outright write about the confinement of women, right? So at max, they try to express discomfort, right? Or Gothic again became a tool to express feminine rage because Gothic was a very own Victorian trope which was being used in the novels, right? So the
mm.
only aspect of Mad Women in the Attic which I can see in the songs is this feminine rage. As for the idea of confinement, the songs do not very vividly attest to that.
Right, right. I think that is that answers it very well. So I think we have any other questions? You can just raise your hand and or like unmute yourself and ask the question. I think Zora is trying to say something. Okay, so we don't have any other questions visibly. So thank you, Zohra, for joining us today and like delivering this beautiful talk. And thank you. Choitali is also congratulating. Okay, lot of people. Yeah, so Kiran, Susan, Joseph, Sebastian is saying that it's a great effort. So yeah, of course it is. So we are grateful to all of you for joining today. We
Thank you for
are
having me here. I am as well honored to be here and share this space. Thank you so much for having me here. It was great interacting with all of you.
okay. Thank you so much, Zora, for joining us. And I think it was one of the best talks in delivered in this channel. So yeah, with this, I think we will take your leave. Thank you for joining Victorian Sundays.
Yes, thank you again, Zora, as well as those who attended today's session. And I absolutely loved the way in which you made your slides. It was like the slides were in a way they were like meta slides, slides explaining the slides themselves, and like each portion having their own significance in one single slide. That was fantastic. I hope that you publish this somewhere in the near future.
Yes.
I'll
Okay.
see to it in the future. A lot of engagements right now and a few publications coming up already. So, in the due course, maybe I'll look forward to it.
Definitely, definitely.
Okay. Congratulations, Zora. And with this, we will take your leave and see you all next Sunday.
Thank you.
So
Bye
thank you,
bye.
everyone.